Okay, so an attention to detail and accomplishing a set task. Anything else?
Showing up on time.
That's an excellent professionalism. Being timely. There's a key word we're looking for, we haven't really heard yet. I think we're hinting at it, but we're not quite there. Well, you're specialised in your area, aren't you? Yes. And so therefore we would expect you to have certain competencies within that area. Do you know what I mean when I'm talking about competencies?
Knowing how to do what you're expected to do.
Yes, and that you're actually fit for purpose, that you can actually do it properly. Okay. Any other thoughts about what you think professionalism constitutes?
We'll come to that later. You're getting into the fine detail here.
Yeah,
Can you think of a word that connects all of the other things that we're talking about?
Being honest in everything.
Honest is another important element to it.
That's an important component. It's not quite what we're looking for.
Right. Can you hint at the opposite? One of the elements of our professionalism is marking your scripts as fairly and as honestly as we can. If instead we were to look at a mountain of marking and just go through and look at how thick they were and put a mark based on weight, what would that be?
Peer review.
Sorry, what was that?
Peer review.
No, that's not peer review.
That would be biased.
Biased, it'd be incredibly lazy of us, wouldn't it? We wouldn't be looking to see what you've actually accomplished. It'd be very unprofessional. Skills, but we're moving away from the point.
What would we fail in R to you?
Responsibility.
Yes, that's the one we were looking for.
If you look in different dictionaries, you'll find different definitions, but essentially it comes down to the conduct, the aims or qualities that characterise or mark a profession or a professional person. So it's a very generic term, professionalism. Today we're going to concentrate on how professionalism applies to you as a scientist. Okay? Now you'll sometimes hear professionalism used in terms of sport. For instance, rugby league players who've turned from being amateurs to being professionals, and they talk about the professionalism of the sport. Okay? Some of the characteristics we're going to describe today also apply to switching from amateur to professional sport, but it's not quite the same. It's not an ideal comparison. Okay?
The professionalism of rugby union does actually have kind of a presence here, because of course rugby union went from being a game where everyone drank to one where there was an expectation that at least around games everyone was as healthy as they could be, and so the old drinking culture in professional field is completely gone. So that again is an element of responsibility to the fans, the people who are paying your wages.
I don't think anyone told me to on that.
That was after the game, though, wasn't it?
After you retired.
Yes. So, a lot of what underpins this is a behavioural attitude. What do you think I mean by behavioural attitude? And we're going to come up about this again and again.
How do you react to different situations?
Yes, it is about how you react to the different situations, but it's that it should be something that becomes innate within you. It's how you respond to each situation should always be the same. And not that you're just looking to follow the letter of the law, so to speak, but you're actually, all your actions are sort of within the spirit of whatever the so you'll start to understand what I mean by that. So I think we've listed some of the characteristics that I think any employer would expect to see in you in the workplace. We're going to come back to integrity because it's incredibly important. Someone mentioned being respectful, you need to be reliable, have good time management. So someone mentioned being on time, it's incredibly important. You're expected to be both autonomous, so capable of independent work, not supervised, as well as being able to be a good team player. Now obviously some of us aren't always good at being that autonomous in certain situations, but you need to be developing your skills to work unsupervised and to think for yourselves.
So one of the key things, and the reason why this module exists, is to move you towards being as independent as you can be as early as possible.
But you can be an independent thinker within a group, within a team, which is why we encourage some, the laboratory classes we do as groups, so that you can start to see how you need to interact with each other in a constructive way, not a competitive way, that you need to be good team players. And to start recognising we all have strengths, we all have weaknesses. As part of a team, you need to identify what your strengths are and contribute that to the team, not just focus on your weakness. Okay? But it wouldn't matter what you've decided your career path is, you'd still need to identify these attributes in yourself. And when we have employers into the university and we ask them what they're looking for from our graduates, the bottom line is always they want you to be literate and numerate. Okay? They're not really interested in how well you do, well they are, within your discipline, but the key thing is they want literacy and numeracy. Okay? So I know that some of you get frustrated when you get coursework back that's got red pen all over it saying you need to know the difference between the possessive apostrophe and the non-possessive, use it correctly. Well, that's what employers look for, those little details. So do please learn from what we've put at the speaker. Are there any other general attributes that I've missed off that list? Most of you are probably in employment already. What do your bosses expect of you? Just all of that?
I want to say probably being helpful to other workers.
Well, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Helpful to other workers.
So constructive, again, that goes into being a team player, doesn't it? It's that you're positively influencing others. Yeah.
Accountability.
Accountability, which you mentioned before, it's not on the list. That's an excellent one. Yeah. Anything else? Flexibility. Yeah. And I think that if you remain within... Sorry.
I've got a hand that keeps going up
Okay,
here.
sorry.
Politely waiting to go.
But if we think about flexibility, the workforce is becoming a more and more flexible place. So we do need to learn how to adapt our practice to adjust to that. Yes?
The ability to use your initiative.
Yes, excellent. So being an independent worker, recognising when something needs immediate action and taking immediate action, not necessarily waiting for approval before you go through that. So that's a confidence thing. And that also depends on your competencies. So we're going to talk about the responsibility you have to develop your competencies. Now we're going to come back to the key one, which is, as a scientist, is your integrity. What do we mean by integrity?
Yes, I suppose that there's an element to that. What if you try to perform a task to the best of your ability, but it hasn't gone quite right? For example, did any of you have data points that you were not wild about in your plot practical? Were you any tempted to move any of them?
Honesty. So someone said honesty, that's part of integrity. But as a scientist, recording data honestly is incredibly important. Not being tempted to move a data point, or not being tempted to omit a data point. Okay? Omission is, I guess you could describe it as a deadly sin within science.
Yes, I mean there are statistical tests you can do to identify points as outliers, but you can then justify saying, okay, this point was not included in the analysis because, but still has to be in there.
Yeah. And you'll often find in the materials and methods sections of papers when there's talk about statistical analyses, there'll be a statement there actually saying data that was 2 standard deviations away from the mean were excluded in this analysis. Okay, so you're not, it's not so much allowed, but you can choose to remove data, but you must let your reader, or the people you're disseminating that information, know what you've done. Okay? You don't just think, well, no one will ever notice this. Tell them what you've done. Okay? So there's an honesty there.
This does actually connect into lab books as well. Now, something that we've not gone into a lot this year, and will be next year, and it will be important in the year after. All of our PhD students are issued with official lab books that are not supposed to leave the university, have to be checked over by their PhD supervisors every so often. And this, if you're working in a medical lab or whatever, will also be a standard which is expected. It is possible for lab books, even though you tend to think of them yours, to be required as a legal document. And certainly, if you get a grant from any of the big grant-giving bodies, they want an account of how the data that they are paying for will be stored and accounted for.
So quite often, these official lab books have at the bottom of each page a box for witnesses to be signed off. So you'll be told next year when you've got your lab book that you're not to leave blank pages because you're going to come back and write up stuff later. Because the whole idea is that your laboratory book is a record of what happened when it happened, not a historical document that you've gone and thought, oh, actually I'll add this in, oh, did I do that? Oh, I must have done it and written it down. It must be written at the time that you actually do the laboratory work. Okay, so please don't leave spaces in it. Our ones that we give to you aren't as official as that, but we do sign off your laboratory books. So if you leave a page because you've run out of time and haven't written it up, you'll find that whoever's signing it off will just put a great big line through it, indicating that it wasn't finished in a timely manner. Okay, so please, next year, a word of advice, keep up to date with those laboratory write-ups.
So we had a few years ago, the first year we were marking the lab books in laboratory research methods. We had a lot of complaints about the deadline for the lab books being submitted close to some other big assessments. And we were quite cross about that, because what this meant is that students were writing up their lab books
At the end.
at the end, rather than as they've gone along, and so putting measures to make sure that that isn't possible anymore.
Yeah. So I would recommend with your laboratory books next year, because this is good standard laboratory practice, is that you take it in on the day to the lab class, you actually have it dated and put a title up saying notes taken during the laboratory class, and that's where you do your recording of the information. And then, in your own time, you can do the more formal write-up that you've actually got clearly stated exactly what you measured or observed on the day in the laboratory class. Okay? Because we understand that in a 3-hour, 4-hour practical period, you don't have time to write an introduction, the methods and the results and the discussion. You also need time to think about the discussion. So we give you that time to walk away. But actually make sure that you've clearly recorded everything on the day in your lab book. Do not write it on a piece of paper thinking, I'll write it up later really neatly in a beautiful little presentation box. That's not good practice.
So the final year supervisors mark students down if their lab books are too neat. I thoroughly approve of that.
Okay? It's obvious sometimes when someone sat down and written 3 months' work in 2 evenings. There's some very obvious signs. That's not what we're looking for at it's not good laboratory practice. And as Stuart said, if you go out into industry, especially if you're working, say, in the pharmaceutical industry, they need legally to be able to demonstrate that they made an observation on a certain date if they're trying to, go ahead, beat their competitor and stake a claim in something. It will come down to dates in laboratory books. Okay, so who made the finding first? The two people at the back, or three people, like to move down. There's some seats down the front of you. So we're going to talk about a lot about integrity over the next hour or so. And just to show my integrity, the slides that follow, there's about 6 slides that follow, are, you could say, plagiarised. Okay, I have lifted them verbatim, that means word for word, from Teaching the Responsible Conduct of Research in Humans by Stanley Horriman. I recommend this to you to go and read. It's a textbook, it's an online textbook, but it's actually not very onerous to read. Each chapter, each section is literally 1 page online. But it's very well written, and I think covers all the key points that we would like you to think about over the next couple of years. So his first opening sentence on integrity is that research integrity may be defined as active adherence to the ethical principles and professional standards essential for the responsible practice of research. So I think we're going, we will now discuss active adherence, ethical principles and professional standards. So let's start with active adherence. There's a paragraph or sentence under there that describes that, and it's that it means the adoption of principles and practices as a personal credo, not simply accepting them as impositions by lawmakers. Would anyone like to translate that sentence?
Don't treat them as a suggestion, but make them like almost like a law in your own life. So just live by them rather than live as though they're a suggestion.
Exactly. So if you're thinking in terms of the law, it's not just following the law, it's actually that the law becomes the spirit of how you live your life. Okay?
You're doing an experiment in the lab on your own, you get a result you don't like.
There's no one there who will know that you got that result. What do you do?
It goes into the lab and you consider it, but that has to come from you. There's no one there to see you, so it's not just follow the rules. You stand no chance of being caught. Okay, so it has to be coming from inside.
And because we said at the beginning, most of us will become very autonomous. We're going to be working without supervision, therefore it's solely up to you to make sure that you keep an honest record of what you do. Because there will not be regular checks. Although the way that things are moving, there are more checks than there used to be, and so more people are being found in want of their practice. But we're not trying to instill in you today how to avoid being caught out. What we want to instill in you is that personal understanding of how important it is to be honest for yourself as well as for the wider scientific community. And we'll go into that in a moment. So the personal credo is belief.
Yes,
Okay?
I believe.
Yeah. So the Latin. So
Yes.
Stuart's helping us with our Latin there. I believe, and that's what this needs to be. Okay? And not that it's an imposition by lawmakers. And you will find that within science and also, even if you don't go directly into science as a career, there are lots of regulations, codes of practice that we are all obliged to follow.
But isn't there extent that science advances actually determined by lawmakers and lawmakers?
Sorry, I missed the beginning.
Isn't there extent that science advances are actually determined by lawmakers to a point?
say they're cumbersome in a way, but we have to work within society's boundaries.
I mean, that's a very interesting point.
Yeah.
In that, although in some respects our research is regulated in terms of things like health and safety, in terms of ethical conduct towards the organisms we work on in some cases, especially if those are people, and the way we deal with our environment, we dispose of chemicals and so on. In terms of the actual conduct and handling of our data, often as not, there are no real rules and regulations. So this is something that comes from scientists as a professional group who understand that these are the conventions by which we operate. So I think he brings out a very important point. In many ways, these are rules that exist without rules. They are things we understand about what we have to do.
And at the moment that it is an understanding that it's a behaviour that we will follow a convention. But we'll tell you some sad stories in a little while. One of the outcomes of the last story is that the public is becoming much more demanding, that we're much more accountable in the way that they can understand that accountability. So some of the liberties, the ability to do things autonomously might be taken away from us just because of the few bad eggs who practice badly and therefore giving science a bad name. So it is very important that we all, as part of the community, adhere because of personal belief, but also for the greater good of everyone, that we follow these conventions. And we'll go into that a bit more. Okay, so the next part of that sentence, the ethical principles. By ethical principles, we mean honesty, the golden rule, trustworthiness, and high regard for scientific record. We're all happy with honesty? Does everyone know what the golden rule is?
Do you want others? Are you not going to want to?
Exactly. I had to look that one up. So it's the ethic of reciprocity, and it underpins most of our religions, and even those who don't have a religion. I think it's a very accepted sort of, it's what we all expect of each other, surely. Yes? No?
Yes, you get it from Kant as well, the categorical imperative. It's just formulating it outside religion.
Trustworthiness. Very important. Any comments on trustworthiness? Why do you think we need to be trustworthy?
Because without it, we wouldn't understand the results to a point, and we wouldn't be able to converse our results without scientists.
That's right. If the starting point was of any discussion where you disagree with someone, if you faked those results, then you're going to get into something that's an abusive argument, not a proper debate.
You are implying already that you don't trust them if you doubt their data. But if you look at most papers, the way that we learn from each other is through original research papers. There are a lot of assumptions we make when we read those papers. We only see the processed data usually, we don't see the raw data. We are taking it on trust that our colleagues have accurately and appropriately analysed that data and produced a synthesis for us in that paper. Okay? So trust underpins an awful lot of our understanding. High regard for scientific record.
I think before we talked about this in terms of, what this is referring to is the lab book stuff, that we record our data, even the data we don't want to record, and we keep it safe and report it as necessary.
Now we don't end up with pages accidentally being lost because the dog ate it or something like that. That's not an acceptable excuse to lose data. Okay. definition, which is for individuals, research integrity is an aspect of moral character and experience. It involves, above all, a commitment to intellectual honesty and personal responsibility for one's actions and to a range of practices that characterise responsible research conduct. So I'd like to discuss for a moment intellectual honesty. What do we mean by that?
Don't portray yourself as smart than you really are.
It's an interesting one because I think it might explain some of the behaviours we're going to discuss in the bad examples, people thinking they were cleverer than they actually were. But it's not really what we mean by intellectual honesty. That's really an aspect of your character, isn't it?
Yes, and I think by and large they can get found out if you present yourself as clever than you are.
When Stuart's finished.
No.
I was going to say maybe not taking credit for other people's work.
Ooh,
That's a
good
very
one.
good
Yes.
one. Okay, not taking credit for other people's work. So how many of you heard of plagiarism?
Well, this is why we get some exercise about it.
Okay, because it's not intellectual honesty in a way, is it? You're trying to pass off someone else's thoughts. I think
Yes.
another thing.
We already know Lenin is pretty good at biochemistry. There's no sense in marking him again. What we want to know is how good you are at it.
And which is why I put the big thing at the beginning, the slide, making it clear that the next couple of slides are not my work. They are, we're using those that's from Stanley and Pullman. Okay? If you Google them, you come up with a perfect hit. So, I'm acknowledging the source. I'm not claiming it as my own thought. And I think we also have to be honest with ourselves, and I think this is sometimes where some people come a bit unstuck, is that there's very few completely original thoughts. Some people become very possessive about what they think they've, thought about, and don't recognise that others will have had similar thoughts and maybe expressed them similarly, and we need to acknowledge that and actually use that as a team to come, take science further.
So the Darwin and Wallace example is a very good one.
Yeah.
Darwin got sent Wallace's paper. He could have put it in the waste paper basket, but
He didn't. But there are some sort of allegations against Darwin out there that he sat on it for maybe a bit too long whilst he got his thoughts a bit more in order.
yes.
Yes. Which wasn't as honest as he should have been. What other aspects of intellectual honesty do you think we need to think about? Think about your experimental design. If you go back to the the clock experiment.
Probably admitting that you've done something wrong and not forging the results or anything.
Well, we assume that none of you forged your results. But yes, admitting that maybe it wasn't done properly and not sticking to that I did this and so it should have worked out. Looking, sort of recording faithfully what you did and then looking round, thinking laterally and thinking for alternative explanations is actually very important. Okay?
And what about thinking about reasons why things haven't turned out the way they should have?
Yes, and this is actually, I would say, one of the benefits of being intellectual honest. If instead of saying, okay, I didn't get the number I wanted, so it didn't work, sort of effectively blaming the experiment, if instead you say, okay, maybe the design wasn't perfect, why didn't it go as we expected? That way you learn about what did go wrong and understand it better, whereas just going into denial and saying, didn't work, tells you nothing.
And the other thing about intellectual honesty is that maybe you come up with this hypothesis, you are very fond of it, you've got a lot of circumstantial evidence that would support your hypothesis, so you design an experiment to test that hypothesis. But because you become so fond of that hypothesis and you want to demonstrate that it's true, you're not as honest with yourself about how to actually design the killer experiment to prove it or not prove it. You're sort of almost fudging it by determining the result. That is not being intellectually honest, is it?
Yes, to be a properly honest scientist, you have to be willing to commit intellectual infanticide.
Yeah, very much so, on a regular basis. So, you know, intellectual honesty, 2 words, but it actually means an awful lot, and it's very, very important, and I think it applies to every aspect of everything that you're going to be doing. Is there anything else there that we might want to unpick? We're going to go back and look at responsibility in a moment. I think we'll look at the range of practices that characterise a responsible research, conduct now. And these are just a few of them. We could probably spend a couple of hours on these, but we won't. Let's start with the first one. Honesty and fairness in proposing, performing and reporting research. I think we've probably discussed that quite thoroughly now. Are you all happy with that? Yes? The little cartoon there is illustrating what I hope you recognise immediately as bad practice, not good practice. It's what Stuart was alluding to earlier. You're alone in the lab, no one knows what you're doing, no one's going to notice that that third Petri dish disappeared, so I think maybe you just poured an extra one. It doesn't fit with your results, so you just lose it. Very, very bad practice. Okay? Accuracy and fairness in representing contributions to research proposals and reports. And someone mentioned this a bit earlier, I think. I can't remember what was said. But basically not claiming credit for what you haven't contributed to. Many journals now require each of the authors on a paper to write a statement declaring what their contribution was to that paper. In the past, you might find 5 or 6 people on the paper, and if you actually started questioning the authors, 2 of them did the work and the other 3 were just in the lab at the time and actually run the lab and therefore get their name on by default. So there's a bit more accountability now required by journals about who did the work.
Yes, indeed. I've put a story here about a senior academic now retired who asked to be added to a certain paper's authors list because he was short of papers for the RAE research assessment exercise.
Okay, not good practice. And there's reasons for that. One is you're accountable. So if later on it's found that there was something wanting in the work that was reported, well, if you're an author, you're equally responsible for all that information. It doesn't matter that you weren't in the room when the experiment happened. By being an author, you say that you honestly believe that everything in that paper truly happened as described. So that's one thing. The other thing is that representing contributions to research proposals and reports, we live in a very, very competitive world. So people write grants. That is implying that quite often you need preliminary data to go in your grant to support your hypothesis, to say, look, you know, we've thought of this, we'd like to do this big experiment, but we need some funding. This is our little sort of pilot study that we've done that would suggest that we're on the right track. What that is suggesting is don't try and fudge the preliminary data to get a big sum of money to do further work. That is effectively dishonest. You must report things as honestly as you found them. And if you've done a pilot study and found out that it didn't work, then it's immoral really to be asking the funding body to fund you more money to continue on a line that actually is not going to work anyway. But there is increasing pressure on us as scientists to be tempted to do something like that. If you've got 3 people working in a laboratory and they're all dependent on you getting grant money, and you know that someone's got a mortgage and 2 young children and is going to be out of work at the end of the month, and you need to get them another 3-year contract on a grant, you could see the temptation of maybe omitting a bit of data because it undermines the strength of that grant. that is still not an acceptable reason, even though you could argue you're doing it for the greater good.
Yes. So I suppose it gets across that it isn't always simple.
No, there's a lot of different conflicts, and we'll come down, there's a conflicts of interest. So the next one, proficiency and fairness in peer review. We have discussed peer review, haven't we?
We have, yes, and I think we've touched a little bit on with it, whether someone sees a paper coming through that is on the same lines as something they've been writing, and so they maybe decide to spike it so that it's held up, so they have time to get theirs through, easily read by editors, obviously not. But one I've experienced is a paper that was knocked back because the person disagreed with the theory on which it was based. And I sent a letter to the editor saying, in that case, this is not the right place for this discussion to take place. This is a theory that is being discussed. The place for the debate is in the scientific literature, and that means it has to be in the scientific literature. It can't be stopped at this stage. And actually, the referee retracted their comments on that basis. Good of them.
But there's also the, as the reviewer, you do have a responsibility to thoroughly do the review, not to just quickly read it and think, oh yeah, it's more or less on the right tracks, that's fine, except for publication, so it goes out into the wider dissemination, because many of us read, we're always advising you to use peer-reviewed material. We believe when we do that actually it has been thoroughly reviewed, that if there were queries about the way that the techniques were done, that they've been addressed. Maybe on some papers you're not familiar in detail with every technique, therefore you take by trust that it's all been thoroughly reviewed, okay, and that it is correctly described. So that's, proficiency means doing the job properly, not just doing it because you get your name on a list at the end of the year in that journal saying that you've helped. The next one is an excellent example: collegiality in scientific interactions, communications, and sharing of resources. Any thoughts on that one? It's a very, very competitive world. You've all heard of apoptosis by now, have you? And BCL2? Have you heard of BCL2? BCL2 is a protein that's involved in the induction of apoptosis, and in the Howard Hughes lab in the States, one of the lead scientists on apoptosis developed a knockout mouse for BCL2. On the floor below him, working in a sort of reproductive area, was another scientist who was looking at apoptosis, and he wanted to look at BCL2 and its effect on the reproductive axis. So he went upstairs and asked his colleague, same institution, asked his colleague if he could use the model. The other guy who's looking at it in terms of immunology has no interest in reproduction, but the bloke who first made the mouse refused to share the model. Okay, so refused to provide animals. The group downstairs in the reproductive laboratory ended up making their own mouse model. Now these things take 6 to 9 months to produce. You need to breed up the animals once you've successfully knocked out the gene. So it takes a lot of time, but it also takes a lot of money. So you could argue, well, I would argue, that because of the sharing of resources, they wasted valuable time and valuable money that, they weren't really competing with each other. There was no justification for it.
Well, I've heard about a situation like that when I think the SARS outbreak, the scientists are naturally competitive by nature. The World Health Organization said, right, you've got to stop this now, you have to work together right now.
Yeah. So you said scientists are naturally affected by the this is right. We are not as nice as we should.
We have given you an example when we were going through the history of science. There was one character that we mentioned several times who, in recent history, we're learning actually was quite a nasty character. Can anyone guess who or knows who I'm referring to in our history of science lectures? Mr. Newton? He's reportedly, he was, very, lacking in integrity. I can't remember the name of one of the scientists that I spoke to you about. There is no known portrait of it, and it's of him, and it's assumed that Newton was hooked.
Yes.
Yes,
We had a picture, but they
that's
were
right.
someone else. Yes.
But Newton had his pictures destroyed because he didn't want a record of this man because he was so jealous of the work that he'd done. Okay? It is terrible, but, well, we're all human, so you can understand sometimes the human drive, but it doesn't mean that it's right. Okay?
But, I mean, the knockout story you mentioned is a good one. But, of course, the other thing which is important in science is transparency. So, we have to be sure that experiments that are done in one lab can be reproduced somewhere else. So there is an expectation that if someone said, okay, I'm skeptical about these results, can I have the mouse in order to replicate the experiment, that they would then have to do so. And certainly, if they published a paper based on it, they would have to answer some very serious questions if they were to say no on that basis, because that's the point you start wondering whether there's something
A bit dodgy. And most journals now have, as part of the acceptance of your paper and publication, is a requirement that you will make freely available any of the reagents that you refer to in your paper. So if you've synthesized some new agonist or an antagonist, once you've published the first paper, you should be aware that you might receive requests from all over the world to provide them with the product. Now, it's understood that you can't become sort of a mini laboratory, so you're allowed to ask for justifiable expenses to provide that reagent, but you are expected to make it available if they can afford it. And affording things is another reason why collegiality is so important, is because a lot of the work that we're doing now is getting so expensive that trying to do things in isolation becomes just about impossible. So, for instance, if I wanted to do electron microscopy for one of my studies, we do not have the facilities in this institution. I need to make contact with colleagues in other institutions and see if they'll invite me to use their equipment. And that can only happen if you've got a good rapport with colleagues. So collegiality is incredibly important. Anything else on collegiality? It's also how you get the buzz. It's talking to people about your ideas and being honest about ideas, and then they go, oh, I thought of that. Do you know, I thought it was so exciting, but have you read so-and-so's paper? Because that really undermines completely what you're thinking about. And that can save you an awful lot of time. Or it can open up a long dialogue where you read that paper and you actually think, well, you didn't account for this and that. So, and then before you know it, you've got a collaboration going. Okay? That's the importance of collegiality, is working together. Because one mind is good, two minds, three minds better, usually.
Absolutely. This is one of the other places where scientific conferences are so important.
Disclosure of conflicts of interest. What do you think is meant by that?
You're going to work together, you have to know what the weaknesses are and what areas they specialize in.
That's not quite what we have in mind here. What if you, sorry, funding from Logs Pharmaceuticals, and you've done a paper showing that one drug being made by Logs Pharmaceuticals is really useful, then you have to admit that that's where your money is coming from.
Or if you're being funded by somebody where you get the benefit, where you get some benefit, like let's say you get some, you're somehow connected to, let's say, the money that's made at the end from the product, and you have to prove that this product is going to work, and yet you get something out of it. So that's
Indeed.
Yeah, so you must declare. Yeah. And also, sorry? If you work for them, or if they've funded what you're doing, or there'll be benefit in kind if you find the right result for them at the end. Any of those things are conflicts of interest. Sometimes you might be involved that you're doing work for a society or something that's involved in regulatory, regulations, policy development, but you haven't declared that, and yet you found a result that maybe will undermine that regulatory result or support it. You should be declaring that you've also got another interest. Very, very
coming to a
important.
very important example of this in a little bit. Wakefield.
Oh, okay, yes, very, very important example. Right, protection, the last three come down to just, I think, ethical codes of conduct. So, if you're using human subjects, you have a lot of responsibilities to your subjects. We're not going to go into that in great detail today, but I think, and I hope that you're all aware of that we must think about that. The same goes for using of animals in research. The last one might seem a bit odd, but scientists are constantly responsible. Very few of us work in isolation. We often have mentees, so maybe masters or PhD students. You could regard all of yourselves as Stuart and my mentees. We are responsible for nurturing you in your scientific career and development. So we have responsibilities, and we must lead by example. Anything else to add to that?
Not really, no.
I'm just looking at a room full of mentees being a bit, right. While science encourages, requires vigorous defence of one's ideas and works, ultimately research integrity means examining the data with objectivity and being guided by the results rather than the preconceived notions. So I think that actually summarises most of what we've just talked about, so we don't need to go into that in any more detail, unless anyone's got any comments. You all happy? Okay, so responsible research practice also includes some of the following, which really weren't articulated, but I think very important, is that you should be competent at what you're doing. So if you're asked to go and, say in your final year project, you've decided that you're going to do an experiment which will involve your human subjects being put into the bod pod. Has anyone come across the bod pod? It's a very expensive bit of equipment we've got on the 4th floor, and basically someone sits inside with virtually no clothes on, but it, through air displacement, can determine your percentage body fat and your percentage lean mass. So the nutritionists and some of the human med science students use it as part of their project. Now it's a very, very simple piece of kit, but no one should be using it unless they're fully trained on it. Because what you don't want is your human subject getting locked inside it for several hours, and they're likely to be permanently psychologically damaged. It's a very claustrophobic environment. So it's a really simple thing to get wrong, but you need to make sure you're competent to use it before you use it, otherwise you will do harm to your subject. So competency is really important. And we all have to be very honest with ourselves. If you don't really know how to do something, ask.
I heard a story when I was an intern with one of our central facilities who about a student doing an intern at one of the others who went down to the basement to pour out some ether and managed to get a spark, an ether drum this big, a spark, so there was a little flame of ether coming out at the top of the drum. Now, if that had propagated back into the drum, it would have taken half a building with it.
Ether is incredibly dangerous. When I was a postgraduate student, I used to have to distill it because the stuff that we bought wasn't pure enough for my purpose. And the PhD student before me in the lab had been rather careless one day, and he'd actually only got distracted for about 2 minutes, but that 2 minutes was sufficient that it ignited the fume cupboard and half the building went up. But because of his actions, I was not trusted. So I was constantly being badgered. Are you distilling today? Are you distilling? Do you know what where's the fire equipment? You know, don't leave it. And it's like, I'm competent. I know I won't make a mistake. But people are scarred, obviously, when they're running out of a building that's on fire. So being competent is incredibly important, and you've got a responsibility to yourself as well as those you're working with to be competent. So if you're ever in doubt, don't let pride get in the way. Ask. Okay? Very, very important. It's very important that you always leave your own workspace or a shared workspace or a piece of equipment fit for purpose, fit to be used by the next person who's going to follow you. So that means it needs to be clean, safe, and the piece of equipment needs to be properly shut down so that it works the next time someone comes to use it. It's a very little thing, but it actually makes a huge difference to how you'll get on in any laboratory working. You soon fall out with your colleagues if you're leaving things in a mess each time. They're not there to clean up after you. You must be responsible yourself. And it means doing things properly and safely, not thinking, uh-oh, the last train leaves at 5 tonight, I need to leave the building in 5 minutes. What am I going to do with this bottle of reagent? I'll just pour it down the sink, no one sees, they won't know, and rush off. Because it could be whatever you poured down, shouldn't have been poured down. And you might end up causing an accident simply because you were careless and didn't follow proper procedure. So you do need to do things properly. Anything else to add to equipment? Centrifuges. We're always telling you about making sure they're balanced, don't we? Again, as a PhD student, there was a great big centrifuge I used to have to use, and the person before me hadn't noted that the rotors were, the brushes on it, there was a red light flagging, and he'd actually put it on and then gone off, and I came into the room, put my stuff down and turned round to find that this centrifuge, he'd also unbalanced it, was so unbalanced it started rocking and it was moving out of its place, and it's several ton. I mean, it's a really, really big, heavy machine, and it's only because it pulled itself out of its cord that it stopped. And I was getting trapped between the bench and I couldn't get out to the door. So, you know, it's easy for accidents to happen. You need to really think each time you do things. A lot of the stuff that we do potentially can be quite dangerous, but not if done properly. Knowing and adhering to both local and national regulations and the codes of. Stuart's already mentioned, you know, health and safety codes. You're using radiation, you have to adhere to all sorts of codes, including how you use that and how it will go out into the environment. You know, we're responsible to the wider environment to make sure that we're not releasing radiation out into it. And there's also different ethical codes that have to be adhered to. And we're not going to go through those in detail now because we don't want you to be overwhelmed and put off completely. But over the next couple of years, as we do things, you'll be introduced to new codes. The one code you do need to know about, which you should already know about, is that pink booklet that Keith would have talked to you about in your first week here. Okay, which is the basic health and safety code of practice for working at the University of Westminster. Some of you, I don't think, have read it too carefully because I've seen you waiting outside on the 5th or 6th floor, or the 6th floor, maybe the 7th floor for a class to start, and you're eating a bag of crisps or whatever, there should be no food consumed on the 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th floor. So even if you're not actually in the laboratory, you're not supposed to have food up there. And that's actually listed in that booklet.
I certainly wouldn't eat up that.
No, I don't think any sane person would actually eat up there if you think about all the chemicals that are potentially lying in that dust around you.
Bacteria too.
I'd like to think about that. Right, so we're going to give you some examples of when people have done things wrong. And I think once you're thinking about this, also think that sometimes it goes terribly wrong, but it's an honest error. Okay, it's not always because someone's deliberately trying to deceive others. But in between there, there's also, I guess, negligence.
Yes, not being careful enough.
Not being careful enough. So you need to look at the intention of the person, because that helps you to understand how their actions should be judged. But sometimes I think negligence is a difficult one when people didn't intend to cause any harm, but because they weren't responsible in how they behaved, they've caused harm. Okay? So I think that's one that gets a bit grey and messy, the negligence. But you need to make sure that you're never negligent. So the first example, look at all those lists. This is a huge list. 7 there, nature papers.
Now, usually you get one paper in Nature and that's your career made. So this person has got 7 in and had to take them out again.
Yes. So these are retracted, so that meant that Nature said that they no longer supported the work and that they published a retraction saying that these pieces of work should be now sort of erased from the public record. Okay, that they did not support the findings. And a Nature paper, as Stuart said, is such a big thing in a scientist's career. This guy had 7 of them, and if you go to Wikipedia and you put his name in, and his name is Jan Schon, you'll find that actually he was a phenomenon. I think he was only in his early 30s when he hit the publishing rate that every 8 days he was submitting a new paper to another journal. So Nature, but also some of the very big journals in, he was into nanoelectronics, so there was the Journal of Applied Physics and other journals like that. So there were papers going off left, right and centre. 40 odd a year, he worked for Bell Laboratories, he was receiving all these accolades, learned bodies were inviting him to be the keynote speaker, he was receiving prizes, he was already tipped to be a Nobel Prize winner in physics, and yet he was only in his early 30s. But some people had problems with the work that he was doing and couldn't reproduce it. So there were questions asked about, how is he achieving all this work? And in the end, those whispers about, well, we've been trying to do this, we can't get it to work like he does, we followed his protocols, it doesn't work. Bell Laboratories decided to initiate an inquiry. And it was sort of flagged, I think, because in one paper, 2 different papers, they found the same figure, but supposedly reporting very different observations. And that triggered this big investigation, which resulted in, I'm not sure exactly the numbers, but there were about 40, 50 papers that got retracted in a very short period of time. He is back in Germany and unemployed. No one will touch him. Okay? Hardly surprising, I don't think, but he generated his data sets using chemical equations rather than actually doing experiments in the lab. So he formulated how he thought the data would behave and came up with data sets to analyse and then present in his papers, which is why he was able to generate so much data in such a short period of time.
I presume he thought that he was enough on top what he was claiming would
Bear
be
its fruit.
verifiable.
Yeah.
Yes.
Except it wasn't. So then another example, this is a bit closer to home. Well, the other thing is, if we go back, was that his disgrace triggered this big debate about the responsibility of his co-authors. So if you look at the papers just listed for Nature, he's not published this work alone. There are several other people who've been involved in it. And that triggered this debate about the responsibility the co-authors had to ensure the veracity of what it was they were publishing.
Some of them are presumably working in the same institution. Shouldn't they have noticed that he wasn't spending as much time in the lab
That
as
he was
he
doing,
ought to have been?
that he was doing an awful lot of work in front of the computer with his calculator. And there was also questions about the peer review process, that maybe it wasn't as rigorous as it should have been, otherwise this should have been spotted much earlier. Now, that debate had actually been started much longer. I mean, it's been going on for years. But a story that's a bit closer to home happened at St George's Hospital Medical School in the department that I used to work in, but it happened just before I got there. So the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, there was a consultant, Malcolm Pearce, who published 2 papers, and this is one of the papers. And he claimed that they had saved an ectopic pregnancy. So basically they'd removed the embryo that had been planted in an inappropriate place, I think in the oviduct, I can't remember the details now, but put it into the uterus and that it had successfully taken and that the child had grown to term. Now, people working in obstetrics and gynecology have tried for decades to find a solution to it. It is a medical emergency and the baby is usually, well, I think usually is the wrong word, is always lost, okay? Because it needs to be implanted in the uterus. So it was lauded, this paper, it was a great breakthrough, although some people were very sceptical to start with. But it did generate a lot of controversy and a lot of debate, and that debate meant that people started asking, well, who is this patient? You know, can we see follow-up studies on the case, you know, and the child and all the rest? And Malcolm Pearce couldn't produce this patient because this patient never existed. And then the second paper that he got in trouble for was a paper reporting 200 polycystic ovarian syndrome patients and a treatment that he practiced on them and helped them with. And again, someone did some sums and worked out that through that clinic, in the time period that he said that he did the study, there was no way that they would have had that many patients with that condition. And that therefore, again, he must be fabricating. And when challenged, he had to admit that yes, he was fabricating the data. Now, the reason why I put this example up is not to sort of name drop because I know of these people, but Geoffrey Chamberlain was considered the leading obstetrician and gynecologist in the country at the time. And it was thought that, he was in line to be awarded a CBE. Because of this case and his fatal statement, which was, I didn't check the information in the paper. I just was happy that my name was on it and it went off for publication. Because of that, he retired in disgrace and is now quite a broken man. His credibility is completely lost with the public and also with his, medical fraternity. They distanced themselves from him. They didn't want to support him in any way because of his association with Malcolm Pearce. So, just by default, you can see how a person's career can become unstuck because they've not been responsible to check that the studies that they're involved in are reputable and credible and true.
Indeed.
And now Stuart's got an even sadder story.
Well, yeah, this one actually comes from Mark Dell. Some of you will know. He noticed a rather strange incident in Cell, which is one of the top biology journals. The same issue included a retraction of Cell paper and an obituary. And it turned out that the laboratory had produced some quite groundbreaking results. And then, as is the case with some of the others, people had tried to reproduce them in other labs and have got back in touch with the person supervising research to ask for some clarifications and check what was going on. So he spoke to the post